Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. Today we're going to be wrapping up our responsive resume project and basically getting ready to move on to bigger and better things. And hey, you know, it's hoodie weather here in Boston, so I hope you're bundling up and getting warmer because winter is coming. All right, so here we go. Let's dive in. So if you remember when last we got together, we took the profile section of our resume and we kind of enhanced it with a photo and made some additional styling rules as it pertained to supporting wider displays. So now we're ready to do the same for our resume section. And if you've been following along with the theme that we have here, essentially the theme basically requires us to kind of have a variant where the progress bar spans the whole width of the resume section, and a situation where as we increase our width, the programming skills section becomes almost a sidebar of our resume section. So we're going to identify when that break occurs, and it looks like it's at the 520 mark. Again, we're using the Chrome device toolbar here, and that's really helps us nail down breakpoints. And we're continuing to kind of stretch this out. It looks like right around 770. Yeah, 770 is that breakpoint. Okay, so what we're going to have to do is we're probably going to have to make some structural changes to our section here, because right now our programming skills section and our methodology section looks like they actually are in the same element, which is actually to our advantage. Pretty fantastic. But our experience and our education are in separate sections, which is going to create a little bit of a headache for us. So what we want to do is essentially we want to get our programming skills and our graphic skills in one parent element, and our employment in our education area in another container element. And that's going to basically allow us to stack them left to right. So we may have to make some structural changes here to our markup in order to accomplish that. So let's take a look. So we've got our professional experience, and I'm using Adam's collapse functionality here just to get a feel for the hierarchy of the information that we have here. So it looks like we've got resume components. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the resume detail sections here in there. That's okay. Yeah. So what we can do actually is we'll just put the skills section in its own section. This is a little bit of a cheat, but that's okay. And when we make such a significant structural change like this, it's really important to refresh your page and make sure you didn't break anything. And we did, actually. Because now we've got this additional break here, which is really not ideal. So we're going to actually add a class to our resume component that is going to be our sidebar, which is this one here, the programming skills listing. So we're going to make that a class sidebar. And basically hope that that allows us to eliminate the border and the margin. So we're going to create a sidebar, and then we're going to have a main section. Yeah, I don't like this approach either. So I'm trying not to mess too much with the semantic structure to support this aesthetic that we're going for. And essentially my mobile first approach doesn't necessarily fit the flow of information as much as I would like it to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this out so that my programming skills and methodologies actually show below. Yes, that's how I want to do it. I'm going to rearrange this so that the professional experience and education shows above semantically. And that's actually most consistent with the way we structured the profile section, so it makes the most sense to just structure it this way. So I'm going to take the experience and education sections, and I'm going to move them up into this new kind of orphaned section that we've created, and that should actually get us to a better place. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. We want our education section also to be there inside there. So we're going to move all of this as well up the chain. Where are we here? There's the professional experience div. We want to put our education directly below that. Okay. So in this case, we're fortunate because we have direct control over what we want to display when. In most projects, you'll have a designer and or a product manager that'll be pretty specific in terms of how you can implement things. And we're going to be dealing with that constraint in the next project where we build the landing page for this show. So definitely join us and stay tuned for the next kind of big project that we tackle as part of the HTML show. But because we can kind of manipulate our situation here, I'm moving the professional experience and the education up. And one thing that we did lose is we lost the special coloring of our education section. So we're just going to remove this extraneous markup, and we're going to move that education selector to be as part of that H4. So actually this goes here. See if that fixes our color disambiguation issue here. It doesn't, so we have to modify our CSS. Education, yep, so we gotta modify this selector to say rather than it being inside an education element, it's gonna be also have that class. So that should get us square, and it does. Excellent, okay. So a couple things that we wanna do here is notice that these sections do not actually adhere to our constraint of observing white space. And we get nice white space observation in the theme, so we want to make sure that we make that adjustment as well. And I believe it's because we don't have these items in a resume detail section, which we need to introduce. So if we didn't have control over the sequence by which we could display these things, we'd have to do some pretty epic HTML refactoring, which is sometimes the nature of the beast. You can benefit a little bit from some upfront planning ahead of time, but sometimes when you move from a mobile-first design to a desktop display, you often have to make pretty far-reaching HTML changes. And it looks like we've got sort of a closing or nesting error here. No, it looks like we're okay. And now we're observing that white space that we wanted to observe. Okay, so we've got that mobile working pretty nicely now with the relocated education and experience. And now we want this to flow so that the programming skills show up to the right after a certain breakpoint. And we identified that breakpoint on the theme to be somewhere around 760, I believe it was. Or 770, yeah. So we're gonna do 760. And basically what we want is we want the programming skills section to show up smaller and to the right of our resume. So we're gonna have to do some pretty crazy media queries here to get this rolling. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're going to specify that we're going to create a history section here. And that represents all of our experience. And then this sidebar component is going to have some special styling so that it shows up to the right of the history. So the first thing that we need to do is actually move this history component up so that it encapsulates the resume title. And we're going to use these history and sidebar classes to basically lay our page out at 760. So we're going to go up to our, because these are pretty layout related items, we're going to go into our resume detail area here. And that's where we'll add these rules. Min width we want to use here as well. We're going to say resume detail or resume component history. And we're going to make the width of that, or the max width of that, 500 pixels. And then we're going to make this an inline block. And then we're going to make the resume component sidebar a max width of 200 pixels. So this is kind of our first stab at trying to make this work. So let's just see what this does when we exceed that 760 pixels width. So we're kind of not even close yet to where we want to get. So notice that this resume component, the width, is significantly larger than what we were going for here. And we're beyond the breakpoint, so something is happening with our resume component where this history rule is not getting applied. So let's look at our computed styling. So we've got the resume component, but we don't see the CSS rule that we've established here. And I think it's because of my semicolon. There we go. Okay, so we made a little bit of headway in that we've gotten our professional experience to only span 500 pixels. So we get that rule applied, and we can confirm that based off of our media query here. And you can see that the computed style sheet rule here has what we would expect. And what we need is we need to bring our programming skills up to fill this void here. And we'll probably have to make some adjustments to the overall layout of that sidebar element once we get it up there. But the first step is really just getting it in place. And I have a feeling it has to do with things like margin and padding. But let's take a look for illustrative purposes why this isn't showing up. So we've got a 200 pixel width, and then we've got a margin established on our resume detail, which is okay. It's our resume component. So we probably just need to actually decrease by a pixel here. Let's find out. So if we said so this should be 199 pixels in width, which should actually get it to show up to the left of the other section. So we've got the resume component history and the resume component sidebar, and they're both inline blocks, so they should not clear. So let's continue to kind of mess around here, see what we can find out. So I'm going to just progressively decrease the width until I get that component to kind of come up. Let's see if it actually moves the needle for us. And it looks like the clearing is still taking place. Oh, there we go. So you see what at that moment, that threshold where that programming skill shows up to the right on my screen? That tells me that there's some padding or margin or some math that I'm not considering that I need to. And it looks like it's right at that 416 pixel mark. And it looks like it's due to some margin to the right. Actually might have to do with some padding set on the body. No, it doesn't look like it. So there's some unnecessary white space here that's causing us some pain. So let's try to find out and isolate where that's coming from. So it's not from the resume component, and it's not from the JavaScript itself. I'm sorry, the programming section itself. So we don't yet know what is causing that. If you remember, we did set a margin of for our document, our body tag here, but that shouldn't affect our situation. And what we want is essentially this to show up side by side to the resume. And I mentioned this in the previous episode, but it's actually clear that very often when you're dealing with layouts like this, you actually need to have more content on the left side as opposed to the right side. So that's also causing us some pain, and that's why we're seeing white space here. And essentially what we can do is we can make use of a new technology called Flexbox, But Flexbox is still a little bit slow to be adopted in some of the major web browsers. So we can't actually use Flexbox here, but Flexbox is a wonderful new emerging technology to check out. And we may actually cover it in our approach to the landing page project that will come up in another episode. But for now, we've got the constraints that we have. So we're going to set our vertical line for both of these to top. A little bit of a typo here. And because I'm now creating a new style sheet rule that encapsulates both, I can move some redundant rules. All right, and we discovered that it was at 416 pixels where we got the actual behavior that we were going for. So we really have to find out the source of this white space issue. Because we want this to be flush. We don't want that additional white line. So I'm just having a little bit of trouble with some screen real estate here. So let's try and figure out what's happening. So the width of that, what happens if we immediately breaks? And then what happens if we adjust the width of the sidebar? Immediately breaks. So to get around this particular issue, if we wanted to, we could actually put these in a container section that actually has the same background color. And that would help, but we really want an explanation as to why this white space is occurring. It could be because the markup itself is white space sensitive, but I don't think we have any. We don't have any white space in between. Let's just see if this has an impact. Sometimes you get white space insensitivity, and that's exactly what it was. So see, essentially I had white space in between these two sections. And sometimes the browser can be sensitive to that, particularly for inline block and inline elements. So that's why we experience that particular issue. And there's still a subtle white line here that's affecting us. So let's see if we can actually change this. Now that we've addressed that white space issue, we should be able to mess with those pixel widths. And there we go. And actually we can increase it to 419 pixels, and we get a nice flush background color, which is great. All right. So we're going to change this to 419 pixels, and we've got a nice persistent look and feel. And like I mentioned, because we're dealing with a non-Flexbox solution, sort of the hack is to always make sure that your left side has more height than your right side. So right now we're dealing with kind of an askewed situation where our left side is not as wide as the right side. So we've got some issues there. We're gonna have to put these in a container anyway to persist the background color uniformly. So we're gonna say up here, we're going to create a new section, and we're going to call it resume or experience container. And we're going to move all of the markup that we have inside that experience container. And that actually has to encapsulate both components. Where's our sidebar here? So we're going to take that, and we're going to take our history and our sidebar sections, and we're going to contain it inside this container element. Close that section tag. And then what we can do is set the background color of our experience container. To the same background color as these resume components. So we're looking at this EE color. And now we just have to essentially, we'll duplicate a piece of professional experience to basically make it look larger. And by design, when you do your resume, your experience section should be longer, at least 2 rows. And there we go. Okay, great. So now what we need to do is, in our media query, make sure that we depict that we want our section to have that background color for us, which I thought we did. Experience container, background color. And then for both of these, we want to set the border to none, remove that border. Good. So now what we need is something that fills this void, and putting it in that experience container should have done that for us. So let's just make sure that that style sheet rule is getting applied. Looks like I have a typo in my markup. I do. So there we go. Now we're getting that consistent look and feel that we're going for. And instead of applying that border to the sections themselves, we can apply the border to the container now. And we only actually want to do that in the case of being beyond that breakpoint. Because otherwise we'll get 2 border bottoms, which will be redundant. Lost my spot here. Where'd I go? So we're here. We're going to move, so we want this dot experience container to have a border bottom that matches our resume component. And we can use Chrome Inspector to get us there. That's this color. And see here, we've got the double border that I was sharing as a problem. I think I undid that by accident. So we're going to say border bottom none. And that should get rid of that duplicated border. Excellent. All right, so lastly, we're pretty much at the home stretch here. Lastly, we want to just adjust our styling to introduce some additional white space. And we also want to kind of make the font a little bit smaller because this is a sidebar element. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to consider the overall height of this button and kind of push this section down according to that. So let's do some math and make sure that we're doing the right things in terms of the heights that we have going here. So it looks like we've got a min height of 55 pixels, and then we've got 30 pixels of vertical and top and bottom padding. So we have to consider essentially 30 plus 55, that's 85 pixels. So for our sidebar element, we need to set a margin top. We'll start at 85 pixels. We're going to have more work to do there because of some additional padding. Or not. So we go to our sidebar element here, and it looks like 85 pixels was a little overzealous. So let's rearrange our windows a bit here so you can follow along. I need the full width here. So it looks like we're not flush. And I believe that's probably due to the H4's margin here, which we're not considering. So I'm going to actually adjust the H4 so that it doesn't have a margin top. So that way we can pretty much guarantee that it's flush with professional experience. That's what we really want. So that's going to help things along a little bit. Okay, and then we've got some minor tweaking to go to get the rest of this looking professional. So 85 pixels is a little much. Oh, because we're dealing with a border box, actually, I think that's probably why. So we're in a border box basis, so our min height is 55 pixels, and that's inclusive of the top and bottom padding. So the margin I want to set is actually 55 pixels and then some probably. So we've got, now that it's flush with the resume button, now we have to observe the rules of our section here, which the H4 has a margin that's consistent with the margin that we replaced. So what we can do is we can actually get rid of that special selector here for consistency purposes. The less selectors in general, the better. The less you have to maintain. And that's looking pretty good. We may just want to add some padding to this particular element just because that's what this title has. If you remember, we set padding to 5 pixels. So we can actually just add another 5 pixels to our margin top here if we'd like. And that should line things up just nicely. And it does. So then in our sidebar section, we could also adjust the font size to be a little bit smaller. And of course, we then have to make adjustments to the actual header in the margin that we just introduced. We actually don't want to apply it unilaterally because we actually like the header itself. So we add another rule for resume detail, is that H4 in the resume detail? It looks like it is. So what we want is we want to isolate some of these elements. So for example, we could decide to just apply this to unordered lists, which is exactly what we're going to do. Dot sidebar UL. We get that header back in line with where we want. We still haven't really affected our font sizes. So it's made our progress bar a little bit more compact, but not our methodologies. And I believe that's because we've got more important rules that are setting font sizes here, taking advantage of the cascading nature of what we're dealing with. So this is taking precedence or multiplying the relative size of our font. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have our selection here in the media query. And also make that smaller, so we're not kind of battling with one another. Methodologies LI. So that's the minimum height, and then we've got the font size here. And then our P tag has a font size, and our span tag has a font size. So those are kind of getting in our way. So we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we're selecting this element. So we want to select the proficiency indicators and the P tag. And then methodologies. I believe they were proficiency indicators. Is that what the class name was we were using? Yeah. Let's see if that moves the needle for us. Doesn't look like those rules got applied. Methodologies P, for some reason, these were not deemed important, which this, because it's more specific, should have taken precedence over this font size, which is interesting. And we try to use this keyword sparingly, but let's see if this moves the needle for us. And it does. But in general, I want to see why, because our media query should, by its nature, make these more specific rather than less specific. But I think it actually comes down to the chronology by which it has been mentioned. So we want to actually move these media queries to be above, in chronology, the other selectors. So let's find the other mention of methodologies. And it's further down the page here. So we're gonna actually move those media queries further down the page so that they get more precedence. Generally, media queries should always come, particularly if you want them to override existing behaviors, they should always come after those elements. So we're gonna move this down. And that should get us the result that we're seeking. And it does. Okay, so we've got some additional sort of tweaks to make here. I think what we can do now that we've got a little bit more width, we can actually make this a little less small. I mean, that's pretty tiny. And we can also fix the alignment that we're dealing with here. So rather than 0.6 REMs, we can kind of play around and get to a aesthetic that we're happy with. And it's just hard to do on this size screen. So we'll just do it directly. Okay. We're going to do the same thing that we did in our profile section, where we make. Well, let's see how they do it here. Oh, interesting. So see how these are side by side in the mobile display, and then as you move them to a sidebar, they show up like that. I'm not sure I dig that. I think I'd rather make them left justified on the same line. So we're going to text the line left. And looking at the rules that we've defined here, we've defined some minimum height that matches our methodology, I'm guessing. Yes. So these min widths and max widths are probably not ideal for our circumstance here. So I'm gonna actually adjust the max width of our P, or maybe it's the min width here. Yeah, that's just too wide. So we can get a little less aggressive about our min width. And what we need to do is essentially achieve the nice balance of the text size and the proficiency indicators. So let's get these a little bit closer together. That's a little better. Pair programming is such a wide concept, so that's creating a little bit of a headache for us. So maybe the best thing is to actually have this hard return design-wise. Because we've got such long headers, that actually holds true here. So what we can do, and this makes things significantly more easy, is we can actually have our P tag just display as a block. And then we've got some white space considerations that we've got to make, but actually this is shaping up to be a lot more pretty. We should have done this from the get-go. That's what happens when you go off the beaten path of the theme. We're gonna reduce the margin, and we're gonna reduce the white space between these elements as well. So that's a height issue. So we want to make the line height the size of the font size. So we're dealing with a too large of height, likely an artifact of, our min height here. So if we get rid of that min height, now things are looking a little bit better. So we want to make that min height auto as well. There we go. All right. And then I think for the proficiency indicators at the bottom after those, we actually do want to have a little bit of padding amongst those. And because this is one list item, we can kind of set that margin accordingly on the list item. So we're going to do that. Margin bottom. And now there's some decent white space. Let's make it a little more pronounced. And there we go. And maybe we want to make the actual titles of these things smaller than the title of the section. So we could decide that we want to make the font size there we go. And then that actually has an impact on our line height as well. And that's looking pretty good. It actually looks significantly better than the theme. If you see the borders here, that's just, I don't know what they were trying to accomplish there. But so that rounds us out for our responsive resume project. So join us next time, and essentially what we're going to do is we're going to embrace a framework for the first time. We're going to be using the Foundation toolkit to basically make this idea of responsiveness and consistency in our layouts significantly easy. And I wanted to do one project without a framework and another with a framework to kind of show you some of the conveniences and wonderful aspects of leveraging something like a Foundation or another commonly used framework called Bootstrap. So we're going to look at Foundation exclusively for our next project, and I hope you'll join us then. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.